Hello everyone, welcome back to another Strategoi video. Ryan here. It's been a minute, but I'm picking back up where we left off with our Rules Roundup series. This will be part 2, focusing entirely on the big man himself, Kragnos. But we'll get into that in just a second. Before I forget, thank you so much for everything you guys have done in helping us get almost to 4,000 subscribers. We're almost there, so share the message if you feel so inclined. And if you like the video, hit like and yeah, let us know what you think in the Discord and in the comments below. But let's get on into it. So a little summary of what we're going to be talking about today. Obviously, this is a rules-oriented series, so we're not going to be looking at necessarily the output Kragnos has or any of the kind of regular stuff we would look at warscroll, but more the intricate kind of rules interactions or implications of some of his special rules. So we'll be starting obviously with an introduction to the series once again if you didn't catch the first video. Then we'll be looking at his rule, the Shield Inviolate, followed by the Avatar of Destruction, and then I've got a little bonus extra for you guys at the end. So the idea of the series in general, the Rules Roundup, is to explore more complicated rules interactions given a test faction, and that'll be Gloomspite Gitz. Now, of course, today we're focusing specifically on Kragnos. My initial idea was I looked at all the rules in the Gitz Battletome and kind of made a prio list of rules that I found to be more or less interesting for you guys as the viewers. And the first video, so this is the second, but in the first video we discussed just faction rules in general that I found interesting. And then I was going to move on to just heroes, but in working out Kragnos alone, I decided, well, I've got enough material here to just do his own video. And of course, Kragnos belongs to all the destruction armies, so this will be applicable to everyone. And so my idea was, yeah, let's take a little diversion where it's not just about Gitz. So anyone that's a destruction player could find this interesting, of course, specifically for a unit they can use. But even those of you back home that are not destruction players, I think you can still get some value out of this. Like I said here, the intended audience is newer players, but also more experienced players who might not have caught a particular implication in some rules might find this interesting as well. That is indeed the desire with these videos, and hopefully they'll be expandable to any kind of armies, and we can actually expand the series to be including whatever you guys find interesting. So let me know down in the comments below. The methodology will be to point out specific rules via a thorough referencing of the official core rules, FAQs, and Battletome rules. And the application, like I said, though it'll be focused on Gitz, it should illuminate options for all types of factions across the gaming system. All right, without further ado, let's take a look at the Shield Inviolate. So I'll just read the rule off here, and then we'll go on to looking at different implications. It's a reaction to your opponent declaring a spell ability. The effect is if this unit was picked to be the target of that spell, roll a dice. On a 3+, ignore the effect of that spell on this unit. This unit, so Kragnos, can use this ability more than once per phase, but only once per spell ability. So there's a little bit to break down here, and more than you might think. But let's start with establishing a question. The question, most spells can only be cast once. So what's going on with the last sentence here? So to repeat, the last sentence says this unit, so Kragnos can use this ability, the Shield Inviolate, more than once per phase, but only once per spell ability. But we kind of know implicitly that most spells can only be cast once. So what is that even referring to? Well, firstly, let's take a look at a similar ability that doesn't have this clause. The spell ignore found on the Dankhold units. If you don't know, there are 2 Dankhold units in the Gitz Battletome. That'll be the Dankhold Trog boss, that's the hero version, and then Dankhold Trogoth in general, which is just a monster that isn't a hero. They both have the exact same rule, and it's a reaction, opponent declared a spell ability, exact same wording as the Shield Inviolate for Kragnos. And the effect is, if this unit was picked to be the target of the spell, roll a dice. That's exactly the same wording as on the Shield Inviolate's first sentence. On a 4+, instead of Kragnos' 3+, ignore the effect of that spell on this unit, exact same wording. But it leaves out the last bit there, that this unit can use this ability more than once per phase, but only once per spell ability. Well, why is that left off? So then we get by not mentioning that this rule, the magical resistance rule of the Dankolds, can be used more than once per phase, should we infer that it can't? So this is one of those examples where you'll see GW using two different wordings, and you might think, well, that extra ability there, the last sentence on the Shield Inviolate was just reminder text. We'll get back to an example of reminder text later. Or you might think this is enough proof, kind of through precedent, that these two rules should be interpreted differently. There's an implied rules interaction, perhaps, because one has this extra text alongside it and the other not. But let's see. So I said the answer is, generally speaking, yes, we could infer that by the kind of act of omission, but we don't have to just infer that in this case. We can also look at the core rules, specifically the rules of one. So at 5.3 here, we see a common rule we're going to come back to a lot in this series, I think. We have 3 bullet points, the first being a unit cannot use more than one core ability per phase. Now, neither of these abilities are core, so that's and the spell ability is not a core ability either, so we don't have to use that here. Second bullet point, a unit cannot use the same ability more than once per phase unless specified otherwise. Now that does seem to be saying something, but we'll come back to it. And then lastly, a unit cannot be affected by the same passive ability more than once at the same time. For example, if a unit is within range of 2 different terrain features that have the cover passive ability, the effect only applies to it once. That's not what we're referring to here, but we'll come back to it. For a different rule. So it's that second bullet point that we're actually most interested in. So according to the second sentence in the rule, it would seem that a Dankold unit can't use the reaction twice, but let's check the FAQ to be sure. And so if you check the FAQ under the rules of one, there's a question. Are reaction abilities, of which both of these rules would qualify to be, subject to the rules of one? For example, if a unit has a reaction ability on their war scroll, can they only use it once per phase? And in fact, the FAQ clears up that yes, that means you can only use it once per phase. So according to the second sentence, it would seem that a Dankold unit can't use that, yes. So this means although a Dankold unit can try a spell ignore, so we're talking about the Dankold Trog boss or the Dankold Trogoth itself. Any further spells targeting them that turn can't be deflected, so choose wisely. So let me give you an example here. You have 2 different wizards in the opponent's army, both of which they're trying to put some kind of debuff or do mortal damage to your Trogoth unit. And say you only have 1 Trogoth unit. You can, of course, try to do the spell ignore on the first one, because you don't know how many they're going to try to target on that Dankold Trogoth. So you say, well, okay, I don't know if they're going to do a second one, so let's try to ignore the first one. You roll a dice, let's say it's successful, you get a 4 up, great. But because that reaction doesn't say that it can be used more than once in that phase, like Kragnos' ability, that second one is just going to go straight through if the enemy spellcaster can get it off and you don't unbind it. So basically they can try to tease out your use of that spell ignore on that 1 Trogoth unit so that the first one, though it doesn't go through, maybe the one they really want to go through is the second one and then you blow your spell ignore. Or maybe they know that you're aware of this and they think you're going to try to do that, so then they don't use it on the first one and then use the next spell on a different unit entirely, doesn't even have a spell ignore. So there's some psychological interplay here that could be going on. Yeah, so that's important, and then that helps explain why Kragnos has that other wording on his war scroll, that you can use it more than once per phase, but only once per spell ability, because as opposed to how it works with the Dankold units, Kragnos can, in fact, if you get targeted with 2 different spells, keep trying to do a spell ignore on a 3-up. Okay, so that's the first bit of that. So our next question is, what kind of spell would this actually be? A spell that would be not able to be used multiple times with Kragnos' Shield Inviolate. So again, this unit can use this ability, the Shield Inviolate, more than once per phase, but only once per spell ability. Well, what kind of spell ability would it be that actually could have come up twice? So firstly, we know that the spell would have to be an unlimited spell, because otherwise it couldn't be cast multiple times in the same phase by definition. I do have an asterisk here. I'll come back to that in a second. But in general, that statement I just made holds. So let's take a look at core rule, magic rule actually, 5.0, Jealous Mages and Fickle Gods. No more than 1 friendly wizard can cast the same spell per turn. unless that spell has the unlimited keyword. Likewise, no more than one friendly priest. That's just about priests, same thing. Keep in mind that each unit can still only use any given spell or prayer ability once per phase, going back to the rules of 1. So again, this is a little confusing, but basically you can only use one spell, a specific spell ability can only be used once per turn by any amount of wizards, as in just use it once and then the other wizards don't have access to it anymore in that phase, unless it has the unlimited keyword. But then they go on to specify, as we all know, that if it even if it does have the unlimited keyword, it can still only be cast once per wizard. Okay, so you basically can cast an unlimited spell as many times as you have wizards, if you so choose. It might not be the smartest move to do so. Anyway, so that's kind of the reasoning behind this unlimited spell thing. But I said we're going to come back to the asterisks. So technically, Nagash and a very limited number of other casters can cast 2 or more copies of the same spell. But these generally have a stipulation that the same unit can't be targeted more than once per phase. For example, Nagash's his warscroll spell is not an unlimited spell, but it kind of feels like it would be, but the other way around, where he can cast as many times as he wants, but he does have to have different targets every time, and he can either put a 5-up ward on a friendly death unit, or he can do D3 damage to a unit that's holier than 18, if I'm not mistaken. But it does say in the wording that you can't keep targeting the same thing, because he's got like 9 casts or something like that, and so you couldn't just keep hitting Kragnos with that. The rule itself keeps you from doing that. So that is, you don't need the Shield Inviolate's last phrase in order to turn that off. It's just built into the spell. That said, Lord Croak's warscroll spell is a notable exception, but we'll come back to that at the end of the Shield Inviolate portion of this video. Okay. So back to Kragnos. Unlike the Dankholds, he can in fact have multiple attempts at ignoring spells in the same phase, but only once per spell on the basis of its name. What do I mean by that? In other words, each spell ability, quote unquote, has a unique name that distinguishes it from other specific spells. So if you're looking at, I don't know, what's a good example? Gosh, I'm blanking right now off the top of my head. But if you were to use a specific spell that has a given name, that's what keeps you from using it over and over again. Okay? Okay, question. What kind of spell would this actually be? Secondly, that unlimited spell would have to be one that doesn't only create a persisting effect, otherwise it couldn't stack. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, let's come over here to some rules. So here's the Seraphon Unlimited spell. It was actually difficult to find one. Well, not an unlimited spell that creates a persisting effect, but one that doesn't. But we'll get to that in a second. So Mystical Unforging is the unlimited spell from one of the 2 spell lores that Seraphon wizards can choose. So Mystical Unforging, the effect is you subtract 1 from the rend characteristic of the target's weapons until the start of your next turn. As you see, it's a spell and it's unlimited. And it's putting on an effect that stays until the start of your next turn. Now, if we consult some of the rules here, persisting effects, this is Core Rules 28.1. Some abilities have effects that aren't immediately resolved. For example, add 1 to save rolls for this unit for the rest of the turn, or this unit has ward 5+ for the rest of the turn. In this case, of course, with Mystical Unforging, we have subtract 1 from the rend characteristic of the target's weapons until the start of your next turn. These effects count as the effects of passive abilities for their duration. So if it applies basically a buff or a debuff that stays on the unit for a certain amount of time that isn't just instantaneous, then it counts as a passive effect. And if we look at the implications, the rules of 5.3, that third point there, a unit cannot be affected by the same passive ability more than once at the same time. Which means here's an example of an unlimited spell that could in fact hit Kragnos multiple times. So if you had 2 Seraphon casters, they could technically each cast Mystical Unforging. All right. If the first one casts and is successful, right, in getting that 3+ or a -1 rend characteristic, then you wouldn't need the Shield Inviolate to stop the second one, because the second one wouldn't be able to stack yet another -1 rend onto Kragnos. That said, and this is a caveat that is important, if in fact Kragnos does ignore the spell the first time on such a spell, so an unlimited spell that does have a persisting effect, then of course the second time could in fact be attempted, right? Because you can't be affected by the effect, but if you unbind a spell, which happens between the declare and effect stage, then they haven't been affected by the effect yet. So I could have put that in the notes too, but I guess that kind of went out without saying. So again, for clarification, or for clarity, if Kragnos, a Seraphon wizard, tried to put this spell, Mystical Unforging, on him the first time, and he succeeded at spell ignoring it, then that you could try again a second time, and he's not allowed to try to spell ignore it because it's the same spell ability again. That said, if he failed the spell ignore on the first time, there's no reason to use it a second time. Because they couldn't cast it on him a second time. He wouldn't be affected. It would be a waste of a spell. So that's kind of what I'm getting at here. But yes, if he does in fact succeed at spell ignoring it the first time, then you could, of course, hit him again with the spell. That's an important distinction. I didn't include in the slides itself, but here we are talking about it. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. So it would generally have to be an unlimited spell and one that doesn't have a persisting effect, excepting the thing I just mentioned. The most common spell effect that meets this second criterion, that doesn't create a persisting effect, would be inflicting mortal damage, since it doesn't linger. You just do the damage, it doesn't put a buff or a debuff, and then it's just instantaneous, and then you could be hit by it more than once. On the other side of the equation, so not talking about mortal damage, but on a positive side, we've got healing, would also fall into this category, but no opponent is trying to heal your Kragnos, right? That would be something you do to friendly units, generally speaking. I suppose there could be a downside to a spell somewhere where it does a really strong debuff, but then on the other side of it, to compensate for it, it heals that unit for some reason. But generally speaking, you don't see that. But yeah, those are probably the two most common examples of an effect that could be caused by a spell that is temporary and doesn't create a persisting effect. Okay, so here we have an example from Tzeentch. This is their unlimited spell in one of their two spell lores. It's Bolt of Tzeentch. You inflict D3 mortal damage on the target. It also has the keyword Weird Flame, but that doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about right now. So the implication here is while Kragnos could ignore this the first time, any subsequent times that phase couldn't be ignored. So if we think about that same situation, we've got two different Tzeentch casters, and they can both cast Bolt of Tzeentch on Kragnos. If he successfully ignores the first one, then the second one couldn't be ignored, second or subsequent. In fact, if he unsuccessfully ignores the first one, so he rolls a 1 or a 2 on the spell ignore, then that damage goes through, and then he still can't continue to try to use the Shield Inviolate until it's successful. It doesn't matter if it's successful or not. That's important. So this is an example of an unlimited spell that could keep hitting him, and then he can't keep warding it off. There's another one. I think there's only one more, if I'm not mistaken, but there might be a couple more. Actually, there's a spell from Cities of Sigmar that I think it's called Chain Lightning. That one could be, it's an unlimited spell that could also do temporary damage like this and not create a persisting effect. And then Slaves to Darkness has theirs, which is doing 3 flat mortal damage at the risk of causing damage back to the caster. Those might be all the examples. Returning briefly to Lord Croak's spell, since I mentioned that, Celestial Deliverance, this is his warscroll spell. He can cast this spell more than once per phase, pick up to 3 different visible enemy units within 18 to be the targets, make a casting roll, and then inflict D3 mortal damage on each target. So the implication here is, while it does say that each time it's cast, you have to choose 3 different units, so not Kragnos 3 times. Croak is a level 3 wizard, and thus could target Kragnos a total of 3 times, 1 with a spell ignore and 2 without. So let's say the first time he tries to cast Celestial Deliverance, Kragnos is one of his 3 targets. Kragnos either successfully or unsuccessfully shield ignores it, or spell ignores it with the shield. And then the remaining 2 times, that Croak player knows that he can just target Kragnos and there's nothing he can do about it. Okay? So these are some examples of things that would be caught with this second clause here in the Shield Inviolate, that this unit can use this ability more than once per phase, but only once per spell ability. In short, while this rule is strong in comparison to that of the Dankholds, it's not only +1 to spell ignore, but can keep doing multiple spell ignores in the same turn, the number of spells that would actually be affected by the second clause is quite minimal, is quite small. which is good for Kragnos in the long run, that there's a limited number of spells, although it's technically a downside that those rare examples can get through his shield from time to time. So that was kind of a complicated rule. We talked about multiple different elements here. With regards to the difference for the Dankholds, and also looking for a spell that actually needs to, that's impacted by this second line. But that's just more of kind of understanding a broad sense of what's actually out there, and then trying to understand what the implications are with such an ability. Okay. So let's move on to the Avatar of Destruction ability. This says, if this unit, so Kragnos, would be automatically destroyed. There are some abilities that can auto-slay a target. It is not automatically destroyed. Instead, allocate 6 damage points to it. In parentheses, ward rolls cannot be made for those damage points. So our question is the clause in parentheses necessary here, or is it just reminder text? So I mean, ward rolls cannot be made for those damage points. So let's first make a distinction between inflicting, in quotes, and allocating, in quotes, a certain amount of damage. Okay? So although you might be tempted to read this rule as having something to do with mortal damage, you'll notice that mortal is never actually referenced in the wording. All right? So we said instead of being automatically destroyed, allocate 6 damage points to it. Damage points, not mortal damage. And this is kind of the beginning of us understanding what's actually going on here. But we can get very specific with it. So we're going to compare the wording in the core rules. So for 17.2, we've got mortal damage. Some abilities inflict, in rules bold, mortal damage. If an ability inflicts mortal damage on a unit, add that number of damage points to the unit's damage pool for that ability. And then it says see 18.2 allocating damage. Now, so what you're seeing here is that we've got different stages here. If an ability inflicts mortal damage, then you add a number of damage points to the unit's damage pool. But remember, this Avatar of Destruction rule does not allocate mortal damage. Or doesn't inflict mortal damage, it just allocates 6 damage points. So let's take a look at the damage sequence, 18.0. After resolving the effect of any ability that inflicts damage points on a unit, follow the steps below. If the ability inflicted damage points on more than one unit, blah, blah, blah. The rest of this we don't need to talk about. So the first step is resolve ward saves for all damage points in the target unit's damage pool for if applicable. Okay, so in the damage pool. And then we saw this referenced in the 17.2 rule that it said add that number of damage point to this unit's damage pool. This is a concept that has to do with a kind of summary or counted up, a summed up amount of damage points that have just been inflicted. It could be through crit mortals from a melee attack. It could also be from the normal damage that comes through. But they all get added to this pool, a temporary kind of saving area for all the points that you need to account for. And if you have a ward save, then you resolve the ward saves for all the damage points in that damage pool. Secondly, once that's been done, allocate the damage points in the unit's damage pool and remove slain models. Now, if you know how a ward works, a ward basically says you get to roll, say, a 5-up ward like Kragnos has. And for every one of the points that you save with that ward save, they get removed from the damage pool. So you still have a damage pool when you go on to allocating the damage points, but a ward helps you remove some of those before you actually allocate them. And allocate is the important difference here, the difference between inflict and allocate. So I've circled it here. You'll see the difference between inflict with the step where you're inflicting mortal damage, but then allocating damage points onto the actual unit itself. This is when you use a dice keep record of how many damage points it's taken. This is going to be after the mortal damage is caused and then after the ward saves. But then allocating is when it actually goes onto the unit. And so the key difference is in the timing. Inflicting damage points adds it to a pool that can be warded. Allocating is after wards. Okay? So what we're seeing in the Avatar Destruction rule is it says allocate 6 damage point to it, and then in parentheses, ward rolls cannot be made for those damage points. So the answer is, so no, the rules in parentheses aren't strictly necessary to indicate that the damage points can't be warded. But Games Workshop likes to include the reminder text whenever possible to avoid confusion. Now, that said, it's entirely possible that not every instance of allocating damage in rules that you'll find around the game has this reminder text. So be careful to look for the exact wording and make it clear to your opponent so as to avoid awkward moments. The vast majority of such rules do inflict rather than allocate, including Kragnos' own Rampage, which we'll get into shortly here. But again, my point is, sometimes when GW writes rules, they miss the consistency across every single iteration of such a rule. So when it skips the whole ward step, they call it allocating, and sometimes they might have forgotten to put the parentheses back behind them. When people first started reading this rule, I think a lot of people thought that the parentheses wasn't reminder text, but it was in fact an extra stipulation that this rule had that made it unique from another. And this is one of those places, in contrast to what we saw with the Shield Inviolate rule, where I was talking about, can we infer that because the Dankled Tragus version of the rule had one sentence less than that of Kragnos, that says something about the implied rules underneath it and how the game works. And obviously, that text wasn't in parentheses, but I don't think parentheses are necessarily always reminder text in GW parlance. So keep an eye out for this difference. It doesn't necessarily mean you can infer just because two rules have two different things. Again, just for clarity, if this reminder text wasn't here, the parentheses, ward rolls cannot be made for those damage points, it would still mean skipping ward rolls. So keep that in mind. But let's go on to my bonus thing here, which was the Rampaging Destruction rampage that we've got on Kragnos' warscroll. For those that don't know, basically once per turn army, which you could only do once per turn anyway because you can only have one Kragnos, but it's in any charge phase, including your opponent's charge phase, so long as this unit has charged that phase, you get to pick one of the following effects. The first choice is roll a dice for each enemy unit within 1 inch. On a 2+ on a d6, inflict an amount of mortal damage on that unit equal to the roll. So if you roll a 3, it does 3. If you roll a 6, it does 6. If you roll a 1, it doesn't go off and does 0. But you notice that it says inflict an amount of mortal damage on that unit equal to the roll, which means you put those points into their damage pool, and then you would get to ward them. The second option is pick an enemy monster, keyword monster, in combat with this unit, so within 3 inches instead of 1 inch like the other rule, and roll 2d6. On a 7, so a sum of 7, this ability has no effect. Otherwise, inflict an amount of mortal damage on that unit equal to the results on the dice used for the 2d6 roll multiplied together. For example, a 2d6 roll of 2 and 6, which adds up to 8 and therefore goes through, so because it's not a 7, would inflict 12 mortal damage. So that's the product of the 2 times 6. Okay, and you'll notice that also says inflict an amount of mortal damage, which could be warded. But now, as a bonus, while not strictly a complicated rules interaction, while we're on the topic of Kragnos, I wanted to quickly show you the math for the damage he could inflict against a monster with that second bullet point option. So, a roll of 2d6 has exactly 36 possible outcomes, one each for the doubles. So, for example, if you roll a 1 and a 1 or a 2 and a 2, there's only one outcome for each of those situations, all the way 1 through 6. That's 6. And then 2 each for each of the non-double combinations. So 1 and 2 or 2 and 1 each have their own slot, which creates 30 options in total. 15 different possible combinations times 2, giving you, plus the 6 doubles, giving you 36 options. If you're not convinced, we'll look at a chart shortly. So precisely 6 of these possibilities add up to 7. That would be rolling a 1 and a 6, or a 6 and a 1, 2 and a 5, 5 and a 2, 3 and a 4, and 4 and a 3. So there's a 6 out of 36, or 1 out of 6 chance that you end up doing no mortal damage. Then For all of the other results, we just need to figure out the sample space for the rest of the possible outcomes and compute the average. For example, we have only one outcome that results in one mortal. That would be 1 and 1 you rolled, and then of course multiplying them together gives you only 1 mortal damage, but 3 resulting in 4 mortals. So that would be 1 and 4, 4 and 1, or 2 and 2, all of which multiply out to being 4 mortal damage. So let's take a look at this more thoroughly in a chart. So let's say we've got on the left-hand column there the first die roll and the column titles in the first row, the second die roll. So you see all 36 possible combinations. You'll also notice that the doubles lie, so 1 and 1 or 2 and 2, lie along the main diagonal, that of the line going from the top left to the bottom right. And then you'll see what happens, what you get with them in terms of multiplying the two numbers together. For all of the ones that add up to 7, you'll see that creates 0 mortal damage, which I put in parentheses just to make it clear that that's when the rule fails, because you rolled specifically a sum of 7 on 2d6. And that, coincidentally, or the way it works when you lay out the matrix like this, creates a line on the non-main diagonal, the alternative diagonal. So you can see that we can have any amount of mortal damage possible between 1 or 36, not any amount. We definitely skip a number of options here. Like, for example, there's no way to do 11 mortals specifically. You skip straight from 9 to 12. But this is the layout as it would be. So the next step is to say, what's the frequency that you get each outcome? So these are all 18, I think, of the possible outcomes. You've got 6 things that create 0, which is actually your mode. So if you know anything about mean, median, and mode, we sometimes use those interchangeably to talk about the average outcome. That you get 0 mortal damage is actually the most common outcome possible, but it's not the mean. It's not the average that you would expect to see. We'll talk about that shortly. We're on our way to computing that. But this is a way to create a list of all of the possible outcomes. There's only one way to do 1 mortal damage, 2 for 2 or 3, 5 or 6, and that's the most common amount that any one of these values takes on. And the second highest would actually be getting 4, as we discussed just a moment ago. So this is the sample space of all the possible outcomes. So then what you do is you simply multiply each possible outcome by the number of times it can happen. For example, 0 can happen 6 times, so that's 0 times 6. 1 can happen 1 times, 1 by 1. 2 can happen 2 times, 2 by 2, and so forth. And then sum them up. And that gives us a total of 385 if you sum all those up. Lastly, we divide by the number of options. Like you said, there are 36 different possible outcomes, and you have your expected value, or also known as the average or mean. And that gives us 10.69 mortal damage on average. Okay? So though you can jackpot and get 36, or you can get very easily 0, 1 out of every 6 attempts is going to deliver 0 mortal damage, the average across unlimited number of rolls will be 10.69, or almost 11. Here we actually see what the actual distribution looks like. And in contrast to what you just saw with an average of 10.69, this will actually give you a better idea of what's going on. So if we look here, we see a graph of the statistical likelihood that in blue, any single exact amount of mortals are done. We call this the PMF, or the probability mass function. And this looks like that line that we just showed on screen a second ago, where the mode, the highest bar, is for 0. You'll see that it's around, exactly 16.67%. So 1 out of 6. And then you see kind of a weird set of hills where 4 is the second highest, and then you're either seeing 2 or 1 option for all the options that I've got here. Granted, we're skipping any place where you do 0 in between because it just doesn't happen. But anyway, that's the probability mass function. And then what we do to get the reverse CDF is we say the chance that you'll roll, say, like if we look at the orange bar, we're saying any value or higher. So an orange bar for 4 would mean a 4 or more mortal damage. And you'll see that that's around 70%, just under 70% of the time. And this has some interesting implications. Obviously, you're going to do 0 or more mortal damage 100% of the time. You're going to do at least 0, but that's not saying much. If you want to do at least some amount of mortal damage, that would be 1, you see that we immediately drop off to being 5 out of every 6 times. So it's like rolling a 2 up on a d6 that you're going to at least do some amount of mortal damage. But a lot of times you need enough to kill that monster. Remember, this only works on monsters, and a lot of monsters are sitting at least about 10 wounds. And so then we're looking at kind of the possibility that you get, like, let's say 9 or more. So even though the average is technically almost 11 mortals, like we said, 10.69, the chance that you do at least 9 or more is less than 50%. So if you look at where 9 sits, that's 9 plus, and look at the orange bar and see how high it goes on the y-axis, you're seeing it's actually sitting around 45% or so. So even though this is where the averages can be a bit misleading. It's a very swingy rule because the average is influenced by how high that 36 is. That's quite a high number. It's also influenced by how often you could roll a 0, which puts some more weight on the bottom end as well. And so then it averages out to right in the middle there. But the actual chance that you do at least 9 damage is less than 50%. So keep that in mind. Even though you can jackpot on this, maybe your risk reward kind of trade-off that you're willing to take is that you need to at least get 75% or so, then you're looking at about 3 mortal damage or more. So if all you need is, if you want to be at least 75% sure, then you can only rely on 3 or more at that point. But it could be that you jackpot and get 36. That's included in that 75%. It's just a very small amount. Okay? Cool. So that's it for today. Hopefully you guys got something out of this. We'll be returning in the next video for some more Gitz stuff. I'll go back to the heroes, but the specifically Gitz only heroes, to cover some interesting rules interactions. And yeah, let me know what you thought of this video, what you like about the series, what you'd like to see in future videos. Again, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. We're almost at 4,000 subscribers, so I'd love to get us over that threshold. And anyway, until next time, thanks guys, and Ryan out.